Now time for me to welcome on stage another keynote speaker, Matteo Merialdo, Cybersecurity Principal at NEXOVA, another of our precious sponsors. Thank you very much, Mr. Merialdo. So you will be talking about cyber ranges and digital twins.
Yes. Let me just check.
Green button.
Yeah, that sounds very good. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for inviting us. Thanks everybody for being present. I'm Matteo Merialdo. I work as cybersecurity principal in NEXOVA and Starion, two sister companies. We have around 30 years of experience in space and cybersecurity, a bit less in cybersecurity, but definitely more than 1 decade. I will not bother too much with the company slides, if you want, and I will try to enter into the meat of the speech as soon as possible. We mainly deal with I would say security by design in complex engineering projects. That's definitely our route, but we also provide organizational cybersecurity, generally for complex organizations involved in critical sectors, and operational cybersecurity. We provide security operation services and so forth. And in terms of portfolio, is very, very focused on engineering. So cyber range, digital twins, we're starting. We provide complex solution for European Space Agency, Italian Space Agency, and so forth, Security Operations Center, etc. We have a classical program on consulting, if you want, but mainly focus on complex systems and security by design and so forth. We also provide the classical consulting, but it's honestly a small part of the business. And we are pretty strong on the training aspects. Again, technical trainings mainly used using cyber range and emulation. We recently concluded, and that's quite proud of that, to build a new facility in the south of Belgium near ESEC, the European Space and Educational Security and Educational Center, and the Galaxia ecosystem in south of Belgium. And in particular is relevant because we also the facilities for radio frequency penetration testing, the cyber range labs, the cyber range training rooms, and so forth, including also classical secret and restricted facility on a part of the building. So that's a little bit of an overview and also where we are coming from. We work a lot with ESA. We will work a lot with ESA in the future, also with national agencies, but also with new space companies. In particular, we are quite active in the past couple of years to provide security by design support for new constellation, new players in the market, and so forth. So, what I'm going to talk about now, I think the timing is very good with the previous presentation, which I honestly really enjoyed very much about the Cyber Resilience Act. And is a sort of a continuation, if you want, of a speech that I gave 2 years ago here in CYSAT, which was about supply chain in space, and a set of activities that we started doing at the time, and we concluded between 2 years ago and now. So I wanted to provide some results of our tests and our use cases on applying emulation platforms and digital twins in the supply chain risk assessment, evaluation, and testing. So I will not spend too much time here because, of course, it's clear for everybody the importance of supply chain. We were together with the European Cybersecurity Organization in a project to support the European Commission for the ACCC and the National Coordination Centers for a couple of years. And we had the nice interactions with ENISA. And in fact, also for ENISA, it's considered one of the major risks nowadays within our EU cybersecurity landscape. I would say worldwide, but definitely in the EU cybersecurity landscape, supply chain threats are extremely important, as was reported by the previous speaker, so that was quite interesting. Of course, we all know space is extremely important, critical infrastructure following the NIS2 directive, and of course, as every complex system, the supply chain risks are in reality growing. Something that I'm noticing really from the industry is that, of course, the big governmental programs are generally quite well structured from this point of view, We have security management plan that are checking the security of all the suppliers, or at least up to a certain level. So if you take, for example, the security directives of ESA, it's quite well structured, the way in which the supply chain needs to be checked. But if you take a new space company that are fastly producing satellites and constellation, I touch with my hands the fact that there is a general lack of cybersecurity knowledge starting from the prime contractor, and I can't even imagine on the rest of the supply chain. So they use open source tool for the ground segment, open source software for the satellite. The communication channel generally is more regulated because maybe you use CCSDS, but in any case, the global resilience of the systems can be very, very, very easily compromised by supply chain attacks. So that's definitely relevant. And of course, more and more systems are produced, and more the times, the development times are reduced because of competition, because of the market where it's going, and also the geopolitical needs. Of course, without specific frameworks, tools, and approaches, is going to be a major problem in the future. I'm pretty sure. I mean, it's already a major problem. We have a plethora of attacks that I will not repeat. Of course, the VSAT attack, etc., which wasn't even a new space company at the end of the day, but it's going to be a serious issue. And really, I'm touching by hand by speaking with many new providers and new players in the field that leaves a little bit astonished the level of immaturity on these aspects. Of course, supply chain can be extremely complex. Just a representation that's coming from this project that we did with the European Cybersecurity Organization. It's not directly linked to space. But we can also imagine that in some cases, especially for smaller systems, maybe the supply chain involves 5, 6, 7 actors within the consortium, plus, of course, a plethora of shadow supply chain, as it was mentioned before, for everything else that is extremely different to control, which comes from the operating system to the open source software use and so forth. So the problem is honestly extremely complex, and given the short timing of this mission, of the preparation and the launch and the operation of these systems, we need to have tools, we need to have something that helps in order to mitigate, at least up to a certain point, these issues. Again, briefly, well, that's very simple reconstruction of a supply chain, but of course, in the supply chain, we need to consider everything from the material. For example, in the production of a rocket, there may be problems linked to the suppliers that are producing, that are providing the raw materials, that are assembling the raw materials. They are 3D printing the pieces of the rocket. So it's not only on the digital products, but it's basically in all the chain of suppliers that produce something that at the end of the day is used into a space system. The European Commission, I think we are lucky in the European Union. We have several directives. I just picked up the two of them that in this moment seems to be quite relevant. The NIS2 directive gives indication to protect the supply chain, because the type of risk analysis that is mandatory for NIS2 compliance organization needs to take consideration also of the supply chain. And then, of course, as was mentioning before, there is all the part related to the incident reporting. So it's quite reactive, but at least there is a proactivity part of considering the supply chain, at least up to a certain level, within the risk assessment. And that's quite interesting because, for example, if you take an ISO 27001 certification, and I know by practical experience, that part, yes, is considered, especially in the last version, but honestly up to a point. While I think it's much more interesting when you perform your risk assessment over your entity to really have a broader scope. And then, of course, as was mentioned before, I believe that one of the main innovations that is provided by the Commission is the Cyber Resilience Act. Cyber Resilience Act, honestly, in my opinion, has the potentiality to really provide a big boost on strengthening the supply chain across basically all the critical sectors or even non-critical sectors. So that, in my opinion, is extremely, extremely powerful. So that's a little bit of an introduction. There are many tools, there are many frameworks that can be used, there are many expertise that can be leveraged on. what we are focusing on as a company in this moment is to explore the usage of digital twin and cyber ranges in order to support the increased resilience of supply chain and also support the compliance mechanisms and compliance accreditation of within the NIS2 and in the future the Cyber Resilience Act. So what is a digital twin? And that's very similar also to cyber range. There is not a single definition. The first mention of digital twin was coming from NASA around 13, 14 years ago. But in reality it's not a single, a fixed definition. In the way in which we interpret it, we interpret it as very close to the reality, hybrid, meaning virtual and physical representation of a system, where also the data that are flowing throughout the operational system are mirrored and replicated in order to have a full copy of what's going on in the original system. The way in which we interpret the digital twin is on the emulation-based digital twin, meaning that we emulate the original system in a way by which with actual virtual machines, physical appliance, and so forth. And for that, cyber range technology can be used with quite a good degree of simplicity, if you want. Coming back to the original definition of digital twins, in fact, the original digital twins were mainly model-based. So you were building a model that was reproducing the behavior of a system. This can be still necessary in some cases where some things cannot be virtualized, cannot be integrated into an emulation. But for most of the cases, and in particular for cybersecurity needs, a very realistic emulation can solve most of the needs from a cybersecurity standpoint. That's what basically we researched in the past years. So you elaborate your network, you reproduce your network with the full technology stack, of course, can be expensive, clearly, and then you mirror at least the data related to the critical processes, and then you can observe the behavior of the system, of the operational system. That opens an immense amount of possibilities, because basically you can do quite a lot. I will come to that, of course, a little bit later. Why using cyber range technology? Because at least some of cyber range technologies that are out in the market, not all of them, proudly I would say that our cyber range technology can do it, allows to have this high customization that permits building up a very close emulation of the reality. And then, in combination with a little bit more traditional techniques of risk analysis, it's possible to analyze what are the critical processes, also linked to supply chain, that you need to emulate completely, so the full stack, in order to have the possibility to perform attack scenarios, test, trainings, and so on and so forth. Because at the end, that would be the main advantage. So, not the digital twin or an high-fidelity emulation to verify the functionalities of the system from a functional perspective, but focused on the critical attack scenarios that you could have to sustain within your system. And that, I think, it's quite an interesting advantage. And then, of course, leveraging on cyber range technology brings also together all the innovation that the cyber range community in Europe and worldwide is bringing into these type of products. So integration with AI, integration with the cyber threat intelligence, integration with physical appliances like radio frequency security. As we did for our range, we integrated it with our penetration test for radio frequency. So the possibilities are quite high in terms of flexibility of the technology, and also in terms of cost. Of course, going towards a full emulation can be expensive from a capacity standpoint, from a license standpoint. But if we focus on the critical processes and the processes that we believe are more important from a security standpoint, definitely we can reduce the cost of the twin and still maintain a good part of the benefits. So that's quite interesting. We did several experiences in the past. The first experience that we did in reality was many years ago. I was a kid and my hair was completely black. Barbara still remembers that if she's in the room. But basically, we replicated a part of the critical infrastructure in Italy, in Rome, also including some mirroring of the traffic. It was even before considering as a company to enter into the cyber range market, but the potentiality were really big, because we have a very high fidelity replica of this network, with this command and control network, with the traffic flowing, and we could embed very interesting and realistic cyber attacks. The focus wasn't not on supply chain, was mainly on the possibilities to attack the network itself, but the potentialities were already very, very clear. So in the years, for example, we developed tools to scan a network and to reconstruct a network within a cyber range emulation scenario. That's something that we did, and actually we are using because, of course, it saves time when you create an emulation. So how to use a digital twin that maybe you built also for other purposes. Maybe you built it for the functionality checks purposes, if you want, a functionality validation, or you built on purpose for a security standpoint. Well, you can do quite a lot of things. So, for example, you can research on vulnerabilities. You can research on what happens if part of the software is patched, what happens if a new patch is arriving from a supplier, for example. You can do predictive analysis in terms of behavior to sustain some types of attack vectors, for example. So you have your risk analysis, you believe that those are the most important attack vectors, and then you can replicate. I wouldn't say that CYSAT would have been saved in its way, but maybe if they would have had a digital twin and they would have tested what could have happened with the malicious firmware update as it happened, maybe they could have mitigated, at least could have mitigated the results. Maybe not avoided the cyber attack, but at least mitigated the results. Well, that we don't know, but that's, I think, a strong possibility. As a practical example, well, yeah, you can simulate various types of cyber attacks related to the supply chain, not related to the supply chain at the end of the day, because you can have a multi-use of the twin at the end. Now we're focusing on supply chain, but at the end, the use can be multiple. And then you can observe the behavior of the system, and then you can reinforce your security controls. And the interesting thing is that if you have an emulation, the security controls that you reinforce is going to be far less expensive than doing that in operation. And then once you have your test bed updated and tested, then you can report the changes that you want into your operational system. I'm not saying that it's for free, but definitely it's less expensive than then sustain a cyber attack and recovering out of that. Of course, that's more from a compliance perspective for NIS2 and CRA. Of course, a digital twin wouldn't solve your effort on being compliant to NIS2 and on accredit your product under CRA. But of course, if you have such a system where you can put your digital product, well, definitely the auditors are going to be pleased on the fact that you have a good control of how you are testing your digital product or how you are considering your organization from a security standpoint. So definitely it's going to help, and also it's going to help on from a reporting perspective, producing evidence perspective that clearly is an important point on NIS2 and CRA. We are directly working on that in our facility, in particular for what regards the CRA, because we really want to build up our test range in a way by which it can be used for this type of purposes for CRA compliance. So I will terminate, and I don't know how much time I have. Well, I have still a lot of time. I can slow down now the narration. No, because people want to go to break, so it's better if I continue.
No. You have all the, at least 11 minutes and 28 seconds.
That's absolutely fine. So a practical use case. We reported this use case 2 years ago, but we were in the midst of it, so we didn't conclude it, and in particular, we didn't include cyber range technology into it. So I wanted to bring it back, because meanwhile we completed the exercise. It was a very interesting project with the European Space Agency. It was focused on MIT processes, so manufacturing, assembly, integration, and testing. It's a specific type of supply chain, clearly. So we will need to evaluate the compliance to other types of supply chain. But basically, of course, these processes are extremely critical because they are all linked together. There are big chains of suppliers, from the raw materials up to the 3D printing, to the integration with the software, the hardware, and so forth. In particular, here we were focusing on rocket components for rockets from a big company in Belgium, so that was very interesting. We started the activity around the end of 2022. That's why when we provided the first speech in CYSAT, we were just at the beginning. We identified the approach, but now we can bring up some interesting results, and in particular, we can link that to the usage of cyber range emulations into the topic. So what we did was to first analyze these MIT processes to identify the most of the one of them that from a business impact perspective were more important. And then we developed a sort of methodology to drill down in a simpler way, in a relatively simple way, the chain of suppliers. So in particular, for at least one of the processes that we identified, just to give a little bit of numbers, we identified 5 main companies involved, including the prime contractor that was divided into 2 factories. So that's also relevant because it may be the same supplier, but 2 different factories in 2 different countries. So that's extremely important from a supply chain risk perspective. And then, of course, they are not mentioned here, but there are, I think, 6 or 7 companies providing tire-free supplier, providing raw materials. So it was the complete chain. So we identified this methodology to drill down in a relatively simple way the full chain of suppliers. And then we performed a full risk analysis using a BIOS. I don't know if today I would use the same methodology, but honestly it was quite effective. We modified slightly a BIOS for this purpose. But then, once we identified the most important risk scenarios, we created a set of attack scenarios using TTPs, because what we wanted is to have something really practical. So from the risk scenario, having attack scenario that were really practical on the, that could be implemented into a system, because at the end that was the purpose. Then we created an emulation of the prime contractor network and all the inputs, the data inputs that were linked from the suppliers, of course, not only, but also from the suppliers, that were linked to those most important risk scenarios. And we identified a set of use cases. Then the use cases has been translated into attack scenarios that then we replicated into the cyber range emulation. The first one that came out was the risk that the 3D models that are pushed between suppliers for pieces of the rocket could have been tampered. Then, of course, you print a piece, and then after 3 years, there is a problem on the rocket because the piece is not printed correctly, even with small defects. At the moment, 2 years ago, of course, that's an exercise that should be repeated because the threat landscape can change. But at the moment, that was seen as the most important risk by the company in these aspects. And then, using TTPs, we built up quite detailed, that's quite high level, of course, but we built up quite detailed attack scenarios that then we wanted to enforce into the cyber range emulation that in parallel we were creating, and it took also quite some time because, of course, the systems were complex. And then we built up, well, in parallel, as I was saying, we built up the cyber range emulation with an additional layer on top. So we use our technology, but with an additional layer on top, because something that we discovered during the project quite useful is the possibility to follow the MIT process throughout the various steps. So an email is received, it contains this type of data, the data is processed, and so forth. That's something that the normal cyber range technology or tools, they don't do, maybe because maybe they are more focused on performance evaluation and so forth. So we had to add this layer on top in order to follow all the process. And then we started implementing and evaluating the attack scenarios. The interesting thing, which I honestly really liked, is the fact that having an emulation, it was relatively simple to implement new security controls. So, for example, we implemented multi-factor authentication in a different way because it wasn't properly implemented in the original, and other security measures. There were some channels that were not properly protected. There were some databases that we didn't believe they were protected. So we implemented security measures. We replicated again the attack scenarios, and we noticed that in several cases there was a quite strong mitigation. On that, it would have been much more difficult to do it into the operational system. And by the way, that was not a full digital twin, that was an high fidelity emulation. Honestly speaking, a full digital twin, I'm not sure that would have provided that much benefit, would have been more expensive, but I think we obtained a good result, even keeping the emulation relatively simple. And it was very useful also to be able to follow the MIT process throughout the definition of the attacks. So we added some automation that we didn't have in origin in our range, which was in any case useful, because especially for this type of processes, it's definitely beneficial. So it was quite successful, and out of this experience, we started building additional verticals in our range exactly for this purpose. So we are continuing the research on the subject. So to conclude, and I think we are perfectly good, definitely, well, there is no holy grail, there is not silver bullet tool that can solve everything. We strongly believe that this type of technology, properly used in terms of combination between cost and effectiveness, can be extremely useful, especially for complex systems. Clearly, you may need to have your digital twin to test in the super precise way your functionalities of your system, but if you can have something that can at least replicate the major risks, the major attack scenarios that your system can sustain, is going to be extremely, extremely useful now and in the future. And, of course, from a compliance perspective, it's going to help both from a CRA perspective, but also from an issue and whatever else is going to come afterwards. And that without using modern technology, without investing an insane amount of money, which could be the risk if you take a little bit of an older approach, if you want. And I think I'm done. I had one last slide, but I will leave it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Merialdo. Great timing. We have 1 minute left before coffee break. And
fantastic.
So I will ask you one question. So yes. I think the audience was really interested in the solutions you presented. I've seen many people turned on their smartphones taking picture of your slides. So just to let you know, and I wondered, well, enforcing this regulation can be costly for SMEs and small players. You offer solutions that can be game-changing for them, but how can they cope with that?
So I honestly believe, of course, less money you have available and more compromises, at least in this type of approach you need to take. But at the end of the day, it's not particularly expensive to create a relatively close emulation of your reality, performing some iterative risk analysis, but at least, okay, it's not going to be a digital twin of your infrastructure. If you are an SME, you don't have probably the money to invest on that, but at least you can have a tangible proof that the most important things are protected enough. It's not the whole proof, because maybe it's not close enough to the reality, but I think it's enough at least to highlight problems and to show possible solution. So I think that especially opening this approach using modern tools like CyberEngines and emulation platform can really help not only the big players, but also the small players. Going down, at least the methodologies that are following in particular this type of analysis, like this revised version of a BIOS that we elaborated, that's honestly, that's not particularly expensive. So even that part, I personally offered to a small space company not so long ago, a couple of months ago, exactly this type of analysis, because their budget was really short, but at least for that, they have some high-level insurance about their company and the few main suppliers in a constellation that they would like to launch.
Thank you very much. I am extremely sorry. There is one question from Adam Flizikovsky. I'm sorry, Adam, we will not be able to broadcast it, but I warmly invite you to come and meet Matteo Merialdo right now.
With pleasure.
No coffee break for you, I'm sorry.
No problem.
Thank you for your presence, and we will be continuing these talks at 11 sharp. Have a nice coffee break. And thank you again,
Thanks a
Mr.
lot.
Merialdo, and for the support of NEXOVA.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.